And here we are. Uh, Welcome to another episode of The Opposite of Cheating. Today we are with Professor Guy Curtis of the University of Western Australia, as I'm sure you can all read. Guy and I have known each other for a long time online and have worked together on all sorts of interesting projects, including edited volumes and most recently a conference in Bangkok, Thailand. Guy, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
So, why don't we get started with a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the context that you work in, particularly at Western Australia?
I'm an associate professor in psychology at the University of Western Australia. I've been working as an academic for, about 25 years. My early research was in, I guess, what we'd call applied social psychology, but also very early on in my career, I conducted some studies on student plagiarism. And as I got into the education side of being an academic teaching, I got interested in why students didn't understand, say, just referencing and citation rules, and got first cases of plagiarism that I noticed when I was marking students' assignments, and this was back before Turnitin existed, so we had to kind of notice that there were similarities with texts that we were familiar with, or we got similarities between other students. And so I got quite interested in the topic of academic integrity. And increasingly over my career, and probably really the best part of the last 10 years, it's been the main focus of my research. So I've looked at things like psychological predictors of engagement in plagiarism and cheating. I've looked at things like ways to educate people about academic integrity, and things like rates of academic misconduct, particularly contract cheating and plagiarism. So I've sort of been quite diverse in the area of academic integrity research.
So much good stuff to talk about. I think we may even break this conversation up into parts because we want to give people an opportunity to hear about all of these things. Why don't we start out with the most evergreen of all of these questions, which is the question that you and I probably both get the most often, which is, do students really cheat all that much? How many students are really committing these kinds of misconduct? And I think your work on this has been some of the most definitive. So would you tell everyone about it?
Sure. Back in 2004, 21 years ago, I first supervised a master's student who was wanting to do a project on plagiarism. And her interest was actually in whether there were cultural differences in engagement in plagiarism. So this student had previously taught English in China, and she was interested in the idea that the Confucian culture of China, there was a way of doing academic writing that paid deference to the master. So you didn't change the words of the master, and maybe you just wrote things down word for word and copied things out and engaged in rote learning. And all of that might suggest that students from Asian cultures would plagiarize more. And it's sometimes the case that when someone is not from an English speaking background, we notice plagiarism because if they've copied a sentence that's in clear English written by an English author, and then they've written their own bits around it where their English isn't so good, the copied pieces stand out. And so there's perceptions that there's more plagiarism by international students and Asian students. And what we did was we gave students scenarios that represent plagiarism. So a student, for example, uh, copies a sentence from a book, puts a name and date reference on that, but doesn't put the copied sentence in quotation marks. And we would ask the question, is that plagiarism? Have you ever done something like this? And how serious do you think that is? And so we collected that data on seven different forms of plagiarism, like that, as defined in a paper by Walker in 1998. And we looked at Asian international students and local Australian students, and we were looking at them in their second semester of study. So we did that because we wanted students to have had a chance to learn about what plagiarism is and to have engaged in some writing assignments, so that if we're asking them, have you done something like this, they actually have had a chance to do it, rather than asking students when they first start at university or college. And what we found was that the Asian international students and the local students plagiarized at about the same rate. They understood plagiarism equally well. They, both groups thought it was serious, and so as a whole, that was kind of interesting. And what was interesting to me in that was that the kinds of plagiarism that students misunderstood or didn't think was very serious was the kinds of plagiarism that they did more. So that got me thinking about, we need to educate students better to increase their understanding. Maybe they'll plagiarize less. We need to change their attitudes, so maybe they'll plagiarize less. But what all this told me about rates of plagiarism as well was kind of interesting, that something like 80% of students had engaged in at least one form of plagiarism at least once. The
It's a
survey told me
lot.
that. So that was 2004. At the time, text matching software existed, but it wasn't universally used in the university that I was working in at the time. And so the opportunity came up for me to rerun the same survey 5 years later. I had another master's student interested in doing a research project. They didn't know what they wanted to do, and I suggested to them maybe we could rerun this survey and see if the results are different. And we found that plagiarism in all of its forms seemed to have gone down. Uh, Understanding had improved, attitudes had improved, and that was kind of curious. So 5 years after that, I thought, well, it'd be great to rerun that study and get another snapshot in time, which I did with the help of a colleague, because by then I'd moved to another university. And then I did the same thing 5 years later and 5 years later. So now I've got data using this same survey every 5 years for the past 20 years. And what it showed is a trend of plagiarism decreasing over time, students understanding plagiarism better over time, and students taking plagiarism more seriously over time. At the same time, we've still got something like in the most recent survey, which is 2024, nearly 60% of students still having done some kind of plagiarism at least once. And that is partly because there's lots of kinds of plagiarism that you can do inadvertently. There's lots of kinds of plagiarism that people could probably do and get away with if they're only doing it, say, one sentence copied in an assignment or something like that. So that's where I guess I initially started on the question of rates of plagiarism. But a few years later, a colleague of mine, Joe Clare, who I've worked with quite a bit, was interested in the question of contract cheating. So this is where students pay someone else to write assignments for them. And Joe's a criminologist, and he said, look, one of the patterns we'd expect in unethical criminal behavior is that the people who do it will do it a lot, because something like 80% of crime is committed by 3% of people. There's some people who just do nothing, and there's some people who do things over and over again. And he said, but we don't have any information on that for contract cheating. And I said, well, as it happens, this survey I've been running previously, we give students a scenario that was a form of plagiarism that we called ghostwriting. It was initially defined as that, but the scenario is a student buys an assignment written by someone else and submits it as their own. And we ask them if they've ever done it, and we ask them how often they've done it if they've done it. And I can look at that data and I can tell you whether the students who do it are doing it more than once or just doing it once. And we looked at that, and that's exactly what we found. We found that students were saying if they had done it, 60% of them had done that more than once. So that was an interesting thing. It was a nice theory-driven kind of question that we could ask of that data of frequency of engagement in plagiarism or cheating. And then kind of thinking more on this, what we also had was about 3.5% of students on average when we got the results of a bunch of surveys saying that they had bought an assignment and submitted it as their own. But what I know as a psychology researcher is that if you ask people if they've done something unethical or if they've done something embarrassing, they're typically not going to tell you quite so often that they've done these things. And this goes back to even years ago, I was in a conference presentation, just happened to see someone talking about this really interesting survey they did where they asked people about embarrassing behaviors like picking their nose. And they had two methods of doing this. One method was your typical survey where students fill in the survey, hand it in, And the other method was they filled in a survey, they put the survey in an envelope, they put the envelope in a pile of other envelopes, and they knew that the researchers sitting at the front of the room couldn't just look at their paper survey and see what they had said. And when they had done things that way, they got increased reports of people doing things like picking their nose. I thought, okay, well, I need to look into methods for seeing whether people can we can get a more truthful admission to engagement in these kinds of unethical behaviors. And a colleague actually put me onto a paper about research misconduct. In the research misconduct paper, they'd used a method where they had an incentive for people to be truthful, and they also got more than one estimate from people that they could put together to figure out how frequently research misconduct was happening. They asked people not just, have you, say, fabricated data, but they also asked people, how often do you think other researchers have fabricated data? And people tend to know what people like themselves do. They might say, well, I don't do it, but other people do it, and I know they do, and that frequency estimate's kind of helpful. And they also asked what percentage of people who do this would admit to it. And if you take the number of people who admit to it and then divide it by that estimate of how many people would admit to it, so if there's something that 10% of people say they do, but only half the people who do it say that they do it, the real number is probably 20%, right? So
Right.
we get the admission, we get the estimated admission rate, and we get the estimated prevalence among other people, and then aggregate all that data. And we do that under conditions where there's an incentive to be truthful, which that bit's a little bit complicated, and I don't need to go into for the podcast. People can go read the paper. Uh, but what we found was that instead of the 3.5% average engagement in contract cheating, the estimate ends up more like 8 to 11% estimate of engagement in contract cheating. So it's like one student in 10 buying an assignment or finding an assignment through, say, a paper mill and putting their name on it and submitting that as their own, um, which is scary.
Yeah, and it's a much bigger difference than we're seeing our surveys too.
Mm. Yeah, many times higher than the typical self-reported amounts of data. And then from time to time, when I see a survey, which we occasionally do, where you do get 10% of students admitting to something like contract cheating, my mind immediately goes, well, is it probably more like 20% then?
Yeah, we've always said in our surveys that the number we get is what we call the minimum bound. We know
Mm.
it's higher, and now we have evidence to show that it's higher from your work. The question, of course, remains what that factor is, and you can't. And as we've talked about, we really need to try to estimate that factor for a bunch of different behaviors.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let's pause this as we'll call this part one of the interview. And then when we continue next time, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about this, as you've had long experience both in the classroom and as a scholar of academic misconduct. And I'm sure everyone would like to hear a little bit about how we take these data and turn them into practical advice and behavioral changes on our end. So that'll be the thing that we do next in part two.
That sounds great.